There are moments in history when everything changes, not because of a system, but because of a single person bold enough to defy it. October 2022. The capital of Burkina Faso is in chaos. Soldiers are on the move. The flag of the nation is being lowered and raised again under new command. A soft-spoken captain, barely in his mid-30s, steps forward. Ibrahim Traoré, a name that until that day was nearly unknown outside military circles, and even less so beyond the country's borders. But what followed shocked the world. In less than 48 hours, Burkina Faso had undergone its second military coup in just 8 months. The nation, overwhelmed by escalating jihadist violence and internal political fractures, was now in the hands of its youngest ever leader and the youngest head of state on earth. International news scrambled to catch up. Who is Ibrahim Traoré? Became the question, echoing across headlines from New York to Nairobi. Analysts debated, journalists speculated, supporters celebrated, critics raised alarms. But the truth? It's more complicated than any headline. Because Traoré's rise wasn't just about military maneuvers. It was about frustration, boiling over after years of broken promises, foreign interference, and the tragic deaths of innocent civilians at the hands of terrorists. To understand him, we have to go back to the dry savannas of western Burkina Faso, to a modest family that raised a boy with dreams of justice, to dusty classrooms where he studied hard and stayed quiet, to his university years where he trained in geology while also becoming aware of the injustice around him, to the moment he put on a uniform, not for power, but because he believed a soldier should defend the people, not politics. As extremist, violence surged across the Sahel. It wasn't foreign powers that paid the price. It was villagers, teachers, mothers, children. In places the world barely acknowledged, people were living in fear. For many in Burkina Faso, the government's response felt slow, disconnected, corrupt. And in the eyes of Traoré, something had to change. He began to speak more openly. Not loudly, but sharply, surgically. Among comrades, he questioned strategies. In briefings, he challenged commands. And then, he acted. But this isn't just the story of one coup. This is about the birth of a movement, led by a man who believes the future of Africa must be built by Africans, on their own terms. His ideology echoes past revolutionaries like Thomas Sankara, but with a modern edge. Social media became his amplifier. Young Africans saw in him not just a soldier, but a mirror, someone who understood that sovereignty is more than flags and borders. It's about dignity, security, and self-determination. Whether he becomes a lasting leader or another fallen figure remains to be seen. What's certain is that Ibrahim Traoré is more than a man in uniform. He's become a symbol, for some of defiance, for others of danger. So who is Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier? The student, the president, the revolutionary rewriting the rules. This is his story. To understand the man who would one day seize power, you have to understand where he came from, not just geographically, but spiritually, culturally, and economically. Ibrahim Traoré was born in 1988 in the Hautes-Bassin region of Burkina Faso, in a modest rural village near the city of Bobo-Dioulasso. The land is dry, the soil red, and the rhythm of life shaped by farming, tradition, and struggle. He grew up in a household that embodied simplicity, not in luxury, but in values. Respect, discipline, honesty, and endurance. His father a farmer. His mother, like many women across the Sahel, was both caregiver and laborer, tending to children and fields alike. They didn't have much, but what they had was enough to instill pride. In this part of Burkina Faso, people live close to the land. Community ties are everything. Elders are respected. Religion, whether Islam or Christianity, blends with ancestral wisdom. And children grow up fast. From a young age, Traoré displayed something different. He wasn't loud. He wasn't dominant, but he was sharp, observant, always thinking. While many children spent evenings playing, He'd often sit with elders, listening, quietly absorbing their stories about struggle, colonization, resistance. His mind opened early to the reality that power was rarely just, and justice rarely powerful. Burkina Faso, formerly known as Upper Volta, had a turbulent post-independence history. After French colonization ended in 1960, coups and counter-coups plagued the nation. The dream of freedom quickly collided with political betrayal and foreign manipulation. But in 1983, a spark lit the country's soul. Thomas Sankara, a charismatic Marxist revolutionary, took power, vowing to rebuild Burkina Faso on principles of integrity, self-reliance, and Pan-Africanism. Although Traoré was just a toddler, Sankara's speeches echoed across the country. Even in remote villages, his ideals took root. Parents named their children after him. Songs and stories immortalized his courage. And for young boys like Ibrahim, Sankara became more than a president. He became a myth. But myths are fragile in politics. In 1987, Sankara was assassinated in a coup widely believed to be backed by foreign powers. The dream died quickly. What followed was a long, dark chapter of stagnation under President Blaise Compaoré, who ruled for 27 years, a period marked by authoritarianism, corruption, and increasing economic disparity. Traoré would spend his entire childhood and adolescence under this regime. In school, he was always near the top of his class. But it wasn't easy. Burkina Faso's public education system was underfunded, teachers underpaid, and rural schools often lacked basic materials. Many students dropped out. But Traoré pressed on, walking miles each day, sometimes barefoot, driven not by ambition, but by purpose. He didn't dream of being a soldier back then. He wanted to be useful. Maybe a teacher, maybe an engineer, someone who builds, who fixes. But the more he studied, the more he saw the gaps between the theory in books and the reality on the ground. Textbooks spoke of freedom, yet his people were trapped in poverty. They spoke of democracy, yet elections felt predetermined. He began to feel the contradictions not just in politics but in life. His family, like many others, were devout Muslims. Faith played a quiet but constant role in his upbringing. It wasn't dogmatic, it was grounding. It taught patience, resilience, humility, and perhaps most importantly, a moral compass that stayed with him as he grew. He was especially close to his mother. In interviews, he would later speak of her as his emotional foundation, the person who taught him to never fear hardship and never forget his roots. She used to tell him, "A leader without soul is like a tree without roots. It may stand for a while, but it will fall." The 1990s and early 2000s were a difficult time for Burkina Faso. While global markets soared, the country struggled with droughts, infrastructure collapse, and a growing sense of abandonment. The outside world rarely paid attention. The international headlines focused on richer nations. Inside, people suffered silently, but young minds like Traoré's were watching. Around age 18, he left home to pursue university education, eventually enrolling in the University of Ouagadougou, where he studied geology. For a boy from the village, this was no small feat. But even there, he was known for being different. While others chased grades or positions, he kept to himself, reflective, humble but principled. Friends recall heated debates in lecture halls about the country's future, African sovereignty, and military corruption. It was also at university that he was exposed to international perspectives. He read about Latin American revolutions, the writings of Frantz Fanon, the speeches of Patrice Lumumba. These thinkers didn't just challenge colonialism, they dismantled its mindset. And in Traoré, these ideas took root. But the most formative experience wasn't in a classroom. It was during a field trip to a rural mining site. There, he saw firsthand how international companies exploited Burkina Faso's natural resources, while local communities lived in poverty. The disconnect struck him deeply. It was a moment of awakening. Knowledge alone wouldn't change this. Power would. He began to consider the military, not as a place to gain status, but as a path to gain tools. In Burkina Faso, where political systems were compromised, perhaps the only way to defend the people was to wear the uniform. But the choice wasn't impulsive. He wrestled with it for weeks, months. Friends say he grew more introspective, more focused. And then one day, he stopped questioning. He enlisted. He wasn't running toward war. He was walking toward responsibility. A responsibility seeded in childhood, shaped by injustice and fueled by a fire that had been building his entire life. This was the birth of a soldier, but more importantly, the birth of a purpose. By the time Ibrahim Traoré made the decision to enlist, he had already walked a path most of his village peers never reached. He had completed university, held a degree in geology, and gained a reputation as a thoughtful, morally grounded student. But that wasn't enough. For him, intellect without action was complacency. The corruption and injustice he observed weren't abstract. They were personal. And he believed that real change, especially in a nation like Burkina Faso, required something deeper than debate. It required sacrifice. He enlisted in the Burkina Faso, armed forces with a quiet conviction. No press, no fanfare. Just one man entering a world known for hierarchy, conformity, and danger. Military life hit hard. Training was brutal. The army stripped everything down to bone: routine, identity, even comfort. Early wake-ups, relentless drills, and psychological endurance tests were daily reality. But for Traoré, it wasn't punishment. It was purification. Every hardship, every drop of sweat felt like a necessary cost to prepare for something greater. Unlike many recruits, he didn't just obey orders. He asked questions. Not out of rebellion, but out of principle. What are we protecting? Who do we serve? Why are our villages still vulnerable? Those questions didn't make him popular with every superior, but they earned him something rarer: respect. At military academy, he showed an early blend of technical skill and ideological depth. He studied battlefield strategy, but also obsessed over Africa's post-colonial power structures. While others memorized drill routines, Traoré was reading Che Guevara, Frantz Fanon, and the writings of Sankara. For him, being a soldier wasn't just about firepower. It was about purpose. He soon entered specialized training in counterinsurgency, focused on understanding guerrilla warfare, desert tactics, and the Sahel region's growing jihadist threat. The threat was real. Terrorist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS were destabilizing entire swaths of West Africa, exploiting poverty and abandoned regions to build influence. By the late 2010s, Burkina Faso was rapidly becoming one of the world's most dangerous countries. Dozens of soldiers were dying each month. Civilians were being slaughtered in attacks that rarely made international news. Schools were being shut down by extremists. Nearly 2 million people were displaced. Traoré, now an officer, was deployed to the northern front lines, where the state's presence had all but collapsed. What he witnessed there hardened him, but not into a cynic, into a leader. He saw villages without water, kids without schools, elders forced to choose between cooperating with jihadists or watching their families executed. In one village, after surviving a coordinated attack, he reportedly spent days helping bury the dead, before writing a confidential report sharply criticizing both military leadership and government inaction. He wasn't looking for promotion. He was looking for accountability. Among soldiers, he earned a reputation as a commander who led from the front. He didn't issue orders from comfort. He walked beside his men, ate their food, and shared their risks. He started refusing escorts when visiting high-risk zones, claiming if his men couldn't be protected, he shouldn't be either. And yet Traoré wasn't a fanatic. He didn't advocate for war as a first solution. What he wanted was dignity for his country, his comrades, and his people. By 2020, his frustration with the government had reached a boiling point. The Central Command often sent outdated equipment, failed to support regional operations, and maintained cozy ties with foreign powers, especially France, whose influence still loomed large over Burkina Faso's military and economic decisions. Traoré, wasn't alone in his discontent. Among junior officers, a quiet resistance was building. They saw how soldiers bled while politicians posted condolences. They saw foreign troops stationed on their soil, yet attacks continued, and they began to whisper, "What if someone did something?" During a short leave, Traoré returned to his university in Ouagadougou to meet with former professors. He spoke of a new generation of African officers who weren't just military men, but citizens with a mission. He said, "Our uniforms don't make us heroes, our choices do." Behind the scenes, he began mentoring younger soldiers, not to plan a coup, not yet, but to plant seeds, to ask them what they believed in, to prepare them mentally and ethically for a future where action might be demanded. In 2021, the first coup shook Burkina Faso, ousting President Roch Marc Kabore. It was led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, who promised sweeping reforms and national security. For a moment, Traoré felt hope, but it didn't last. Damiba quickly reinstated the same patterns. Cozy relations with France. Delayed responses to attacks. Power centralized in elite hands. It was in this moment, watching another revolution become a repeat of the past, that something inside Traoré shifted for good. He didn't need more training. He didn't need more medals. What he needed was a platform to finally act, and soon, that moment would come. By the time Ibrahim Traoré made the decision to enlist, he had already walked a path most of his village peers never reached. He had completed university, held a degree in geology, and gained a reputation as a thoughtful, morally grounded student. But that wasn't enough. For him, intellect without action was complacency. The corruption and injustice he observed weren't abstract, they were personal. And he believed that real change, especially in a nation like Burkina Faso, required something deeper than debate. It required sacrifice. He enlisted in the Burkina Faso armed forces with a quiet conviction. No press, no fanfare, just one man entering a world known for hierarchy, conformity, and danger. Military life hit hard. Training was brutal. The army stripped everything down to bone, routine, identity, even comfort. Early wake-ups, relentless drills, and psychological endurance tests were daily reality. But for Traoré, it wasn't punishment. It was purification. Every hardship, every drop of sweat felt like a necessary cost to prepare for something greater. Unlike many recruits, he didn't just obey orders. He asked questions, not out of rebellion but out of principle. What are we protecting? Who do we serve? Why are our villages still vulnerable? Those questions didn't make him popular with every superior, but they earned him something rarer: respect. At the Kadiogo Military Academy, Traoré began to stand out, not for ego, but for his intense focus and philosophical depth. He studied battlefield strategy, but also obsessed over Africa's post-colonial power structures. While others memorized drill routines, Traoré was reading Che Guevara, Frantz Fanon, Thomas Sankara, and Kwame Nkrumah. For him, being a soldier wasn't just about firepower, it was about purpose. He once said to a fellow cadet, "If we only defend borders, we are bodyguards. If we defend justice, we become guardians of the future." Traoré's worldview matured through two critical lenses: experience and ideology. On one hand, military training gave him tactical proficiency. He excelled in leadership scenarios, crisis simulations, and psychological evaluation drills. He was selected for specialized training in counter-terrorism operations, focused on guerrilla warfare, desert navigation, and crisis coordination under fire. On the other hand, he began seeing the institution from the inside, its flaws, the foreign dependence, the politics creeping into command chains. His trust in the system weakened, but his belief in the mission, to defend the people, only grew stronger. When he was finally deployed to the north of the country, ground zero for Burkina Faso's terrorist crisis, he stepped into a landscape of fear and devastation. Dozens of towns had been abandoned. Civilians fled villages after repeated jihadist attacks. Entire schools were burned. teachers assassinated, local chiefs forced to either collaborate with terrorists or die resisting. In this chaos, Traoré found clarity. He was known among soldiers as a man who refused comfort. He ate the same food, marched the same terrain, and slept under the same harsh conditions as his men. While some officers distanced themselves, Traoré embedded himself in the pain. In doing so, he earned something priceless: trust. In one now documented case, a village elder told reporters, "That young captain, he didn't talk like a commander. He talked like one of us. He asked questions. He stayed after attacks to help bury the dead." It was during this time that he began writing private letters to former professors and activists, expressing a disturbing reality: that Burkina Faso's war wasn't just against jihadists, it was against institutional betrayal. In those letters, he described shortages of equipment, strategic failures, and the demoralization of troops. He wrote, "We are not losing this war because of the enemy's strength. We are losing because of our leadership's weakness." By 2019, Traoré was tapped for a foreign deployment with the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali. There, he worked alongside multinational forces, gaining first-hand insight into the geopolitics of military coalitions. He saw how decisions were shaped by diplomatic optics more than ground realities. He noticed how foreign agendas often overrode local needs. His time with the UN didn't disillusion him. It sharpened him. He returned with a broader understanding of how the global military and political machinery functioned, and how Africa often remained at its mercy. Back home, attacks intensified. Jihadists controlled more than 40% of Burkina Faso's territory. Over 10,000 people had died, and 2 million were displaced. Yet government leadership clung to tired speeches and Western partnerships that yielded little impact on the ground. Traoré, now a captain, began gathering like-minded officers. Not to plot a coup, not yet, but to build consensus. He believed a new generation of soldiers had a moral duty to act when politics failed. These weren't power-hungry radicals. They were patriots pushed to the edge. He began teaching junior recruits not just strategy, but ethics. He would end training sessions with questions like, "What does loyalty mean if it allows evil to persist?" In 2021, the first coup shook the country. President Roch-Marc Kabore was removed. Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba stepped in. He promised change, security, a fresh direction. At first, Traoré watched cautiously. He wanted to believe. But within months it became clear. Damiba's leadership echoed the very failures of the past. The people remained unprotected. The elite remained untouched. Foreign relations remained unchanged. It was in this disillusionment that Traoré's private convictions hardened into a public mission. He didn't see himself as a politician. He didn't want to wear a sash or sit behind a podium. What he wanted was accountability, security, dignity for his soldiers, for his people, for his country. And as 2022 unfolded, the choice became clear. If no one else would lead with courage, he would. The deeper Traoré went into the system, the more he saw its fractures. Military promotions weren't always earned through merit. They were negotiated. Supply chains weren't broken by bad luck. They were sabotaged by corruption. Soldiers died not because they were outgunned, but because they were forgotten. And still he held on to something, a belief that it could be reformed, that somewhere inside the machine there was still a heart that beat for the nation. But it grew harder. During one mission in the Sahel region, Traoré's unit uncovered a weapons cache intended for local defense forces, still wrapped in French shipping labels. The catch? The village it was meant for had been razed months earlier. The weapons had been sitting idle in a depot, while civilians were being massacred. The rage he felt that day didn't explode. It solidified. He began taking more notes, collecting evidence of neglect, photographing expired rations, tracking troop requests that vanished into bureaucratic black holes. He wasn't preparing a rebellion. He was building a case. It was during this time that something else began to change, the way civilians looked at him. In regions where the military had long been seen as distant, even abusive. Locals began treating Traoré differently. They offered him water, safe passage, information. Some called him by the name of his childhood hero, Sankara. Others simply called him the Honest One. This connection with the people became his armor. In their eyes, he saw the burden of leadership long before he ever held a title. In whispered conversations, he began speaking of a different kind of army, one not owned by power but by purpose, an army whose first allegiance was not to state authority, but to the human beings it claimed to protect. He taught his soldiers that retreating wasn't weakness, if it meant saving lives, that war without justice was terror in uniform, that silence in the face of incompetence was the true betrayal. Not all agreed with him. Some warned him to stop speaking so openly. Others tried to distance themselves. A few higher officers began monitoring his movements, suspicious of his growing influence. But Traoré didn't back down. He intensified his efforts to re-educate younger recruits. Late at night, he would lead impromptu sessions on ethics, national duty, and African self-determination. He challenged them to think critically, to question orders that endangered civilians, and to remember why they joined in the first place. He often repeated one phrase: "Do not confuse discipline with obedience. Discipline requires conscience. Obedience does not." By 2022, these ideas had spread through much of the lower and mid-rank officer corps. They weren't coordinated in a conspiracy, but united in despair. The institution they served no longer served the people. It was only a matter of time. When another ambush in the east left an entire convoy slaughtered, Traoré publicly broke rank for the first time. In a closed briefing with superior officers, he demanded an independent investigation, stating that, "If our command cannot protect us, then it does not deserve us." That sentence made it back to the capital and marked him as dangerous. They reassigned him to a non-combat post, a symbolic demotion, but they were too late. By then, Traoré had already become the quiet heartbeat of a growing storm, a generation of soldiers and civilians who no longer believed the system could fix itself. He never plotted a coup in darkness. He cultivated a consciousness in daylight. He didn't recruit with promises. He led by example. He didn't speak of revenge. He spoke of responsibility. In private, he told a confidant, "We are not trying to take power. We are trying to return to those it was stolen from." By the time the final attacks of September 2022 shook the nation, the choice was no longer if action should be taken, but when. And in the heart of the army, among dusty boots, worn rifles, and restless hearts, one captain was ready to rise not for glory, not for revenge, but for a people no longer willing to suffer in silence. By 2022, Burkina Faso was no longer a fragile state. It was a nation on the verge of collapse. The jihadist insurgency, once confined to the border regions with Mali and Niger, had spread like wildfire. Town by town, village by village, entire communities were falling under the control of armed groups. Some flew the black flags of ISIS, others aligned with Al-Qaeda. Most were faceless, rootless, fueled by a mix of ideology, poverty, and resentment. Their tactics were brutal. Convoys ambushed, schools torched, markets bombed, children kidnapped, elders executed for refusing to cooperate. The countryside became a graveyard for dreams, and silence ruled where the state no longer dared to walk. By mid-2022, more than 2 million Burkinabe had been displaced, nearly 1 in 10 citizens. Over 10,000 people had died in the conflict, many buried in mass graves or not at all. Nearly half of the country's territory was considered outside government control, and still, the world barely noticed. International headlines focused elsewhere. Burkina Faso was too poor, too remote, too complicated to trend. Aid organizations tried to help, but convoys were attacked. Journalists were banned or intimidated. Local reporters were silenced. What remained was a country in crisis, without a global audience. Inside, the people felt it all. The fear, the abandonment, the betrayal. Parents stopped sending children to school, not because they didn't believe in education, but because they believed in survival. Farmers abandoned fields. Entire roads became impassable. Even in the capital, Ouagadougou, you could feel the tension in the air, markets thinner, military checkpoints multiplying, conversations quieter. The government, led at the time by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba, had promised reform. After seizing power in a coup that ousted President Kabore, Damiba claimed he would restore order and defeat terrorism. For a moment, hope flickered, but that hope was extinguished almost as quickly as it arrived. Damiba refused to sever ties with France, the former colonial power still deeply embedded in Burkina Faso's military, mining, and diplomatic affairs. Many believed France's interests were more aligned with extracting resources than protecting lives. Damiba's collaboration was seen not as strategy, but submission, and still the attacks increased. Villages pleaded for help that never came. Soldiers cried out for reinforcements that never arrived. When the massacre in Inata occurred, where 53 police officers were slaughtered after days of unanswered distress calls, national patience snapped. The public began organizing protests. Small at first, then massive. Men and women in the streets holding signs not just of anger but of desperation. No more lies. No more France. No more fear. Some held up portraits of Thomas Sankara, as if summoning his ghost. They weren't calling for politics. They were calling for protection, but the government's response was tone deaf. Damiba gave speeches. He reshuffled ministers. He blamed external forces. Yet no one was held accountable. No resignations. No arrests. No truth. In the absence of action, a new kind of hero emerged. The Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, VDPs. Civilians, some as young as 16, began taking up arms. Trained hastily and armed poorly, these volunteers formed local militias, vowing to protect their villages where the army had failed. It was a desperate, courageous act, but it was also a reflection of despair. When farmers and shopkeepers are forced to become soldiers, a society is bleeding at its core. And the bleeding wasn't just physical. Hospitals ran out of supplies. Medicine was scarce. Ambulances were attacked en route to bombed villages. Entire clinics closed down in conflict zones. Children died from infections. Mothers gave birth in abandoned churches. Trauma wasn't just untreated, it was normalized. Education systems collapsed in dozens of regions. Over 4,000 schools were shut down. Teachers fled or were executed. For many children, a blackboard became a memory, and with it, the promise of a different life. In cities, inflation soared. Bread doubled in price. Fuel was rationed. The middle class, what little there was, disappeared. The poor became poorer, and the rich grew quieter. Trust in government, in institutions, in the army, evaporated. A kind of silent anarchy took hold. The kind where no one believed what they heard, where official statements were met with mockery, where each explosion brought not just grief, but confirmation that leadership no longer mattered. And through it all, one name kept surfacing: Ibrahim Traoré. He wasn't giving press conferences. He wasn't in the news. He wasn't staging rallies. But word of him, of his honesty, his discipline, his refusal to abandon his post, spread mouth to mouth, village to village, WhatsApp message to WhatsApp message. Traoré, still stationed within the military, watched this unraveling with a heavy heart. He spoke to locals, volunteers, and fellow soldiers. They all said the same thing: "We are on our own." One volunteer leader told him, "We don't expect the government to save us. We just want them to stop pretending they will." This was the tipping point, because revolutions don't begin with slogans. They begin with silence. When a people stop speaking because no one is listening, when survival replaces citizenship, when truth dies, and in its place grows only rage. Traoré began compiling testimonies, stories of mothers who lost all their sons, children who no longer knew what a classroom looked like, priests who gave last rites to victims of suicide bombings in roadside churches, shopkeepers who left behind everything they owned to run into the forests with their families. Each story became a chapter in a growing dossier, not of facts, but of failure. He shared these testimonies quietly, in meetings, in letters, in whispers. They spread through the army like wildfire. Soldiers began asking questions they were once too afraid to voice. If the state cannot defend its people, who will? And that's when the question became a movement. And the movement found its symbol, Ibrahim Traoré. They didn't call him a hero, they called him a listener, a soldier who didn't hide behind microphones or armored cars, a man who still believed that leadership was service, not status, and, as the country neared freefall, that belief, once idealistic, became revolutionary. It began on a Thursday night, October 27, 2022. The air in Ouagadougou was thick with unease. No gunfire, no speeches, just rumors, whispered in barracks, buzzing through army group chats, carried quietly from checkpoint to checkpoint. The Damiba regime was no longer feared. It was tolerated. Barely. Traoré had returned from the field weeks earlier, reassigned to a position meant to sideline him. But he hadn't gone silent. He had gone still, like a storm gathering. For months he had been building something invisible. Not a militia, not a faction, a network of conscience, soldiers, sergeants, captains, all united by one question. What are we still defending, if not the people? They had no grand manifesto, no blueprint, just one goal: reclaim the mission. Over months he had built alliances, not through bribes or threats, but through shared pain. Among mid-ranking officers, his name had become shorthand for integrity. Among foot soldiers, he was the only one who stayed with us when the gunfire started. Among civilians, he was the man who didn't speak from balconies but from the dirt beside them. And now, the moment had arrived. That night, power shifted, not with a bang, but with intention. At exactly 2:17 a.m., key units stationed near the presidential palace received a single coded message. Marée. It meant high tide. Within minutes, military convoys began moving into position. Armories were secured. Communication towers were seized. Presidential guards were quietly disarmed. The palace perimeter locked. By sunrise, the streets around Kosiam Palace were sealed. The airport was frozen. No shots fired. By 6 a.m., Burkina Faso had changed hands. Again, but this time, something was different. The coup wasn't announced by a general in full regalia. It wasn't broadcast with threats or rehearsed justifications. It came from a soft-spoken captain in green fatigues, surrounded by young soldiers who looked more like defenders than conquerors. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped in front of the cameras and simply said, "The situation in our country has reached a critical point. We have decided to take our responsibilities. No slogans, no promises of miracles, just quiet, unshakable resolve." His first address to the nation lasted barely 3 minutes. But in those 180 seconds, he did something no leader had done in years. He told the truth. He admitted the failure of the previous coup. He acknowledged the suffering of civilians. He stated flatly that foreign alliances had failed to secure peace. And most importantly, he said this: "We will not govern with words. We will act with results." That single sentence electrified the country. Across Ouagadougou, people flooded the streets, not in fear, but celebration. Not with weapons, but with phones, capturing history. In the north, in cities like Kaya and Dori, where soldiers had once been overwhelmed, local fighters laid down arms in disbelief. "Is it true?" they asked. "Did he really do it?" From buses, people chanted his name. In schools still open, children drew his face in notebooks. In churches and mosques, prayers echoed for guidance and for peace. By midday, Traoré's image had replaced Damiba's in government offices. By evening, new posters, made not by the state but by citizens, appeared across the capital. Traoré, le capitaine du peuple, the captain of the people. But while the public rejoiced, power was still fragile. Damiba had not yet formally stepped down. He was in hiding, reportedly negotiating from a secure military base. Rumors swirled. He had fled to Togo. He was preparing a counterattack. He was trying to call in French reinforcements. Then came the silence. For 48 hours, no one knew if civil war was about to begin or end. And then the moment came that solidified Traoré's place in history. He refused foreign mediation. He refused political theater. Instead, he sent a message, public and unmistakable. Any intervention from outside forces will be seen as aggression against the Burkinabe people. That line cut deep, because for decades, foreign involvement in Burkina Faso's internal affairs had been the unspoken rule. France, in particular, had kept close ties with every regime, military or civilian, but Traoré was signaling the end of that era. On October 30th, after tense internal talks, Damiba finally agreed to resign, on one condition, that he be guaranteed safe passage out of the country. Traoré agreed. No revenge, no public humiliation, just removal. By that evening, Damiba was on a plane to Togo, and the presidency, though still unofficial in name, now belonged to a 34-year-old soldier who had never once asked for power, and yet it fit him like armor. His next act was symbolic. He didn't move into the palace. He stayed at the military headquarters, sleeping in the same bed he had occupied for months. When asked why, he replied, "We have not earned rest. The country is still bleeding." Within the first 72 hours, Traoré suspended the constitution, not to abolish it, but to rewrite it. He dissolved the interim government. He called for a national convention, not of politicians, but of citizens, soldiers, teachers, farmers. He said, "The solution will not come from above. It must rise from below." Across West Africa, leaders watched nervously. In Paris, diplomats scrambled. In Washington, think tanks issued statements. In Burkina Faso, people lit candles, not for warning, but for memory of those lost, of those who had waited too long for someone to speak with truth. Traoré didn't promise utopia. He didn't offer slogans. He offered something more dangerous, more radical, more rare. Hope. Not the shallow kind found in speeches. The kind found in action, in courage, in a soldier who walked toward fire, not away from it. Burkina Faso hadn't just seen a coup, it had seen a commitment. And as the dust settled, one thing became clear: the revolution had begun. Most revolutions end with the seizure of power. Ibrahim Traoré's began there. In the hours after the coup, the world waited for a parade of decrees, slogans, and self-glorification. Instead, they got silence, reflection, and then clarity. Traoré didn't address the nation with pomp or drama. He stood behind a simple podium in fatigues. No tie, no medals, just his voice. And what he said wasn't typical. He didn't speak like a man who had conquered. He spoke like a man who had inherited grief. He began not by naming enemies, but naming pain. "Our country has been bleeding for too long," he said. "This is not a moment for celebration. It is a moment for responsibility." And with that, Traoré outlined a vision. Not just to stop the violence, but to reimagine what Burkina Faso could be. Security from the ground. Traoré's first promise was blunt. The war on terror would no longer be outsourced. He declared that foreign troops had failed, not due to lack of firepower, but lack of heart. He questioned why France, the former colonial power, maintained military bases in Burkina Faso, while terrorism expanded year after year. His answer? They were protecting interests, not lives. So Traoré began withdrawing support from Western-backed operations and redirecting trust to the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, VDPs, local militias made up of farmers, traders, even students. He promised them better weapons, faster training, real pay, and more importantly, dignity. "If you're willing to die for this country, you should never be treated like an afterthought," he said. He expanded recruitment, bringing in tens of thousands of youth from rural regions. It was risky. Some critics feared arming civilians would lead to chaos, but Traoré argued the opposite. The people are not the risk. The people are the solution. Pan-Africanism and the ghost of Sankara won. Week after taking power, Traoré quoted a name most African leaders fear to invoke. Due directly, Thomas Sankara. He didn't just reference him, he echoed him. He said Burkina Faso could not be free as long as Africa remained divided and dependent. He rejected the debt structures imposed by the IMF and World Bank. He rejected the notion that sovereignty was something to be negotiated, and he wasn't alone. Under Traoré's leadership, Burkina Faso began coordinating with Mali and Guinea, two other countries under military transitions. Together, they declared a new alliance, not of coups, but of independence. A vision for an Africa that didn't beg for permission. Break with France. Within weeks, the signs came down. The French ambassador was told to leave. French military forces were given a deadline to withdraw, and Burkina Faso officially ended. Agreements with the Élysée on military cooperation. To many, this was geopolitical suicide. To Traoré, it was necessary surgery. No country can be free if its army takes orders in another language, he said. It was a message not just to Paris, but to all African nations. Your freedom is your fight. A new economy. While security dominated headlines, Traoré turned quietly to the economy, and specifically, Burkina Faso's gold. The country is the fourth largest gold producer in Africa, but for decades that gold flowed outward, to multinational corporations, to European markets, while locals stayed poor. Traoré ordered an audit of all mining contracts. He suspended deals he claimed were exploitative or unclear. He vowed to nationalize strategic mines and reinvest profits into rural infrastructure, healthcare, and schools. And then, in a move few saw coming, he made this statement: if a contract feeds shareholders but not citizens, it is theft. Youth, education, and nation-building. Traoré was 34 when he took power, younger than most of his generals, younger than most heads of state, and closer in age to the students than to the elites. He embraced that. He launched national forums for youth, not to lecture them, but to listen. He asked them what they needed, what they dreamed, what they feared. He promised free vocational training centers in each major region, a push for rebuilding schools in conflict zones, a plan for mobile classrooms, literal trucks carrying books and teachers to reach displaced communities. He said, a country without educated children is a country without tomorrow. And then he warned the elites, if we do not include the youth in our plans, they will become the revolution that replaces us. The media and the message in the first month of his leadership, state television changed tone. Gone were stiff announcements. In came town hall coverage, youth interviews, military updates. Traoré allowed critical voices to be aired, including those who disagreed with him. He said the media should challenge, not praise. His approach was stark. Transparency before triumph. Tell the people the truth, he told his ministers. They can survive any hardship except lies. Traoré's vision wasn't just policy. It was emotional. It was spiritual. He spoke not just of rebuilding Burkina Faso, but redeeming it. We are not just fighting for land. We are fighting for memory, for dignity, for the right to write our own story. His critics called him naive. His supporters called him necessary. But to a country that had forgotten how to believe, he offered a question. What if the future wasn't stolen, but still possible? In the months after the coup, Ibrahim Traoré went from soldier to symbol. But symbols, no matter how powerful, don't govern without pressure. The world had watched Burkina Faso in silence for years. But now, as a 34-year-old captain stood at the helm of a sovereign revolution, silence turned to scrutiny. Western media branded him a military strongman. Diplomatic cables labeled him a destabilizing populist. Economic watchdogs warned investors to monitor the situation. And yet, across Africa, something stirred. The shockwave. Across Africa, in the Sahel, flags changed. In Mali, crowds began waving not just their national colors, but those of Burkina Faso. In Guinea, youth groups referenced Traoré's speeches. In Niger, protesters chanted his name during anti-French demonstrations. Across the continent, memes, murals, and songs carried a message: a new Africa is possible. It wasn't about ideology. It was about courage, about someone who looked the world in the eye and said enough. But inspiration alone doesn't run a country. The weight of power back in Ouagadougou, the real work began. And it was brutal. The economy was suffocating. Gold prices were unstable. Inflation rose, donor funds vanished overnight. Burkina Faso had been heavily dependent on international aid, and now that aid was frozen. Food prices soared. Infrastructure plans stalled. Thousands of displaced families still lived in tents, waiting for government help that couldn't come fast enough. Then came security challenges. While Traoré's reforms were bold, the jihadist threat did not disappear. Some regions saw improvement. Others erupted with new violence. Opposition figures inside the country began asking hard questions. Where's the civilian transition plan? What's the long-term strategy for education and health? Can a government run by soldiers remain accountable? For some Burkinabe, the initial magic began to dull, not into hatred, but into realism. One teacher in Fada and Gourma said, "He's brave, but bravery isn't bred." External pressure and isolation. The international community responded swiftly. Sanctions, suspended aid, critical headlines. ECOWAS, the West African political bloc, demanded a return to civilian rule. France recalled ambassadors. The EU froze security cooperation. The US issued cautious statements on democratic norms. And yet, something strange happened. The harder the West pushed, the stronger domestic support became. Why? Because, to many citizens, international condemnation wasn't about democracy. It was about control. To them, Traoré's greatest offense wasn't military leadership. It was independence. He refused loans, refused foreign bases, refused to apologize for cutting ties with powers that had watched Burkina Faso collapse. Traoré's public defense in a rare extended interview. Traoré responded to criticism. He admitted mistakes, acknowledged economic hardship, but asked this: if democracy means elections but not protection, what kind of democracy is that? He insisted that a timeline for transition would come, but only after territory was secured and systems rebuilt. He said, "You cannot ask a house on fire to pick wallpaper. First, we put out the fire." Fies. A new kind of African leadership as pressure mounted. Traoré doubled down on ideology. He began appearing less often in traditional presidential settings, and more often in community centers, schools, and military outposts. He wore no suits, used no teleprompters, refused limousines. He said, if leadership separates you from the people, it is not leadership, it is abandonment. He called for a League of African Resistance, a moral alliance, not based on power but on purpose, one that included nations like Mali, Niger, and Guinea, and maybe one day more. It wasn't about creating another bloc, it was about telling history. This time we wrote it ourselves. Critics and consequences. Still, not everyone saw Traoré as a hero. Opposition parties, some sidelined since the coup, began organizing. Some human rights groups raised alarms about press freedoms. A few journalists were detained. Some civil society voices claimed intimidation. And while Traoré remained popular with youth and soldiers, older elites and intellectuals warned of a cult of personality forming. Even some regional allies grew cautious. Mali and Guinea admired the boldness, but worried about volatility. The fear wasn't just of failure. It was of overreach, of a revolution moving faster than a nation could absorb. The unfinished story, and so the question remains, who is Ibrahim Traoré, truly? A transitional figure, a visionary, a military ruler with people's dreams on his shoulders? Or just another man who rose fast and will fall hard? No one knows yet because legacy isn't built in headlines. It's built in hospitals that function, in roads that reach villages, in children who return to school and believe they'll be safe. 1 year after the coup, a boy in northern Burkina Faso was asked by a reporter what he thought of the new president. He wears the same boots as my father. That's why I trust him. Traoré's story is not over. It's just begun. A legacy is not a statue. It's a promise, still being tested, and in Burkina Faso the test is daily. But the belief remains. He was never supposed to lead. He was born in a small village under a tin roof to parents who taught him to speak softly and stand firmly. He studied geology, not politics. He wore a uniform, not for glory, but for duty. And yet here he stands, not just as a man, but as a moment in history. Ibrahim Traoré didn't seize power with tanks. He seized it with trust, with a generation raised on broken promises, with farmers who buried more sons than seeds, with soldiers who fought without food and still stood tall. He didn't shout, he listened. And in that silence he became something more than a commander. He became a mirror for a country that had forgotten its reflection, a mirror for a continent that had grown tired of waiting for change to come from outside, a mirror for leaders who speak of dignity while flying first class past the hungry. He rose not with promises but with presence. He didn't sit behind desks. He walked with his men. He didn't quote speeches. He asked questions. He didn't fear foreign disapproval. He feared local disappointment. His power wasn't in titles. It was in timing. He arrived when the silence became unbearable, and in breaking it he broke through. But courage is not comfort, and leadership is not legend. Now every decision he makes echoes louder. Every misstep costs more, and every promise he breaks will feel deeper, because hope is a fragile gift. He has enemies, terrorists in the desert, corruption in the cities, whispers in the shadows, sanctions from abroad, and he has allies, the barefoot children who draw him in chalk, the mothers who see their sons in his eyes, the displaced who hear his name and feel less forgotten, the youth who still believe that Africa's freedom shouldn't come with footnotes. Every revolution tests its maker, and every leader faces a choice to become what he once fought, or to fight what he now risks becoming. That moment is coming. His vision is ambitious. His tools are limited. His country is bleeding. But belief is still alive. Not because of a perfect plan, but because for the first time in decades, someone dared to speak the truth. And truth, as fragile as it is, has always been the foundation of justice. He reminded a nation of its worth. He reminded a continent that power can come with principle, and he reminded the world that sometimes the smallest soldier carries the loudest heartbeat. But perhaps the most important part of Traoré's legacy is that it's not finished, it's not carved in stone, it's still breathing, still unfolding in classrooms reopening in the north, in militias patrolling their own homes because the army couldn't reach them, in women growing food in abandoned fields they've returned to, in villagers turning old battlegrounds into new gardens, in young boys rehearsing speeches in the mirror, dreaming of one day not just surviving but leading, in a father telling his son, "Don't be afraid, we are not forgotten anymore," and in a mother whispering to her daughter, "This is what a leader looks like." Whether Traoré ends as a legend or a lesson, his story will mark a line in the sand. Before him, hesitation. After him, accountability. Because the world saw a captain rise. But the people, they saw something else. They saw a chance, and that may change everything.